Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Thoughtful Talent Show. I'm Jen Werner,
And I'm Chad Ahern.
and today we're going to talk about the Gallup Clifton strength of analytical. Chad, do you want to tell us what Gallup says about analytical?
Sure. So Gallup defines this talent theme as follows. People exceptionally talented in the analytical theme search for reasons and causes. They have the ability to think about all the factors that might affect a situation.
Great. So we're going to get deep today. So I want to start off saying this is not in my top five. It's not even in my top 10. It's my number 14. It's what I would consider a supporting strength, but it
Okay.
is my first strategic thinking strength. So I'm going to
Okay.
lean heavily on you today and how this comes out in you so that we can get our listeners some information about really what analytical looks like. Do
Sure.
you want to share with us how this works for you personally, how you've seen this play out in your life?
Yeah. So first of all, since you shared where it lies for you, I will say that it is my number five uh, talent theme. So it does reside in my top five. I do see it show up pretty regularly in my life. We're going to talk a little bit about that. I think that's maybe one of the reasons why you said you're going to need to lean on me more than I'm going to lean on
Hmm.
you. Um, it is a strategic thinking theme. It pairs very well with a lot of my other thinking themes. I have learner as number one and deliberative as, which is more of an executing, but shows up. And we're going to talk a little bit about the combo of deliberative and analytical in a minute. But when we think about this theme in general, here are a few things that I would say. First of all, that this theme is always has a very questioning aspect to it. And I know when we did our learner episode, there was questioning from a sense of curiosity. I think one of the pieces that really is at the heart of analytical is more of a validation aspect. So there's a quote from the longer description that goes something along the lines of you essentially question to see whether somebody's idea is valid or to see if it's going to wither and die. Okay. And while that sounds very negative, part of the aspect around analytical is to see if this is actually something worth investigating further. Have you thought this through? So that's why
Hmm.
I said sort of that validation aspect is a big part for me. And um, I, you know, it comes from comes out in a way where we're talking a lot about why questions. Why do you think this is going to work? Or what data do you have to support your hypothesis or your initiative or your brainstorm idea? Have you thought further than the superficial?
Yeah.
Um, and it can be a bit of an idea killer if it goes overboard. And we're going to get to the negative aspects of this theme in a minute. But it really does come from a place of validation inspired by a sense of care. You're actually looking to see, does this have legs early on so that you don't get so far down the track, expending a ton of resources, investigating something or trying to get something to work when the forethought hasn't gone into it.
Sure.
So I would say that that's one part of it.
Yeah.
Um, there is also the aspect of this theme loves data. Um, Analytical people immediately start thinking about Excel spreadsheets or data analytics when you think about the stock market or finances. There is an aspect to that I completely agree with. I love myself a good Excel spreadsheet, um, but I think it actually has to go further than that. There's a difference between having vast amounts of data points, having all your cells filled in an Excel spreadsheet, but that doesn't really tell you what's going on. It's the finding the patterns piece that is really at the heart of analytical. So it's that what kind of story can you decipher from the data? So thinking again about Excel, it's the difference between having a big spreadsheet, thousands of rows and hundreds of columns. The difference between that and maybe a pivot table within Excel. And anybody that's used Excel knows what I'm talking about. Anybody that has analytical probably knows what I'm talking about. It's getting to understand the relationship between the data. And so that relationship then tells you a story that then can tell you sort of the cause and effects. And I think that's one of the components I really love out of the short description, is that reasons and causes and factors that might impact a situation. You're looking for that cause and effect. So, oh, if this goes up, then this goes down, or if this goes up, then this also goes up. That's the part I think that sometimes gets lost when people look at the very superficial word of analytical. Oh, you just must love a ton of data. Well, no, I love data that can tell me a
Right.
story. If you can't tell me a story in the data, that's not as interesting or as helpful as some might perceive. So I think
And
those
that's
are,
one of the things I found really amazing when we first started talking about this. Is I was thinking like, yeah, you just want to get all the data, but it's really like you're gleaning of that data, like what you can pull out of it. That's not really like the collecting it, and maybe that goes more to the input, which we'll talk about in a few weeks. I
yeah,
think there's a major difference there. Like you're looking for a purpose
yeah,
into that data.
yeah. Jen, pause real quick. 3, 2, 1, go.
Chad, I think that's great. And you talked a lot about how this shows up with work. Can you talk to me a little bit about how your analytical shows up for you in your personal life?
Yeah, so there was actually that story I had told you in our pre-show about how this shows up in my personal life, and um, that actually has to do with sports. So I play a lot of soccer. I coach soccer, but I also played a lot of basketball growing up, and I still try and get out on the court. And one of the things I've realized about my analytical is that I love to notice the patterns of my opponent. So in terms of particularly in basketball, if I can start to understand, oh, that person always goes left when they want to take their jump shot, or they always go right when they want to hit their layup. That has always driven sort of an anticipation engine for me. I've never been super fast on my feet, so I've always had to put a little bit of thought in ahead of time. But that's, I think, a place where it has shown up outside of my work. And I think it's a really powerful tool that has allowed me to be successful at some of the sports I enjoy. But I also think there's a really neat power, and I'm still figuring out how it translates to my work.
Mm.
But I have started to notice myself picking up on patterns of how people talk, particularly in my coaching sessions. So I'm still working that transition, but I think for people that understand the analytical theme, it does come down to that patterns, and that it can show up outside of work. So somebody that might be, listening to this after, getting their reports for the first time and being like, well, I don't understand how analytical shows up. It might be look at your personal life and where are you noticing patterns or cause and effects first, and then be like, oh, that's where that's coming from. So I just want to put that in the show, because it's, again, a lot of people put it into, oh, it must be about Excel or databases or whatever else. It can be as simple as noticing patterns in how you act. I think I'd actually shared with you, one of the things I always hoped my coaches would do is actually put me on the bench first. I always appreciate coming off the bench first, because it allowed me to watch the player or players that I'm going to be guarding later, so that when I actually went in, whereas if I was thrust right into the starting lineup, as much as a lot of people see that as prestigious, I felt it as at a bit of a disadvantage, because I hadn't had a chance to watch my opponent in action and what it actually looked like. So just a different application. I'm not sure how telling that is for our listeners and viewers, but I thought it was worth mentioning.
I think it's really interesting because I hadn't ever thought of it in that way of like you're always collecting data from anything that might be giving it out, right?
Yeah.
So, and using that to inform decision making and different things, which I think is really amazing because having it as my supporting strength, I use
Yeah.
it as a, like if I need to get more information about something, I'm digging through those data points and places that I'm looking for information, as opposed to it just coming natural to me. So, I mean, I
Yeah.
can analyze data, I do analyze data, but it takes me a lot longer and drains me, as
Yeah.
opposed to, using, some of the other things in my top 5 that just come much more easily to me, using that deliberative to find the risk rather than like
Okay. Yeah.
analyzing the data. Um, we talked a little bit about, you started to touch on some of the negative sides to it, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the pairings of
Oh,
of
sure.
your top 5. Because we had talked a few things, like one I really loved was your difference in, or kind of juxtaposition of harmony to analytical,
Yeah.
and then your deliberative too. So do you want to touch on some of those?
Yeah. So I think um, the commonality that I see between analytical and harmony is a sense of practicality. So while harmony, and we talked a little bit about this in our harmony episode, um, harmony is often, initially viewed as sort of that kumbaya consensus, don't rock the boat. And there is a large component to that. But I think what sometimes gets missed about the harmony talent is that the desire for decreasing emotional instability is really about moving forward, getting into practical action. What can actually be done? And that's where it ties over into the analytical. The analytical is looking for that validation of, is this a practical idea? Is this pie in the sky? Or can we actually do something? Is this reality? And so that shared practical edge is something where I notice it actually a lot in my coaching, where I'm looking and listening for patterns within what my coachees might be sharing, but then I'm almost immediately flipping that information into, okay, so what action do you want to take? What do you want to do next? How does that come out for you? And really looking at the tactical aspect of what can actually be taken forward. I don't mind deep thinking, and there's a good place for that, but it is also about the practicality and moving forward and what can actually be implemented. So I think that's a really interesting pairing for my top 5. And then just to add another sort of layer to it, I'll also share that my analytical and deliberative are almost always working together. You mentioned your deliberative shows up, and we talked a little bit about this in our very first episode about deliberative being a very risk aware, not so much risk averse, but risk aware talent theme. And that again ties in with what analytical does, which is, if you're looking for cause and effect, is the effect going to be a negative one? So there's that aspect of figuring out what the patterns are, and are they telling you about an impending pitfall? And I think that has a positive place, but when we get around to talking about the negatives, and we can go right there if you want to. So I will say that for me, in my personal experience, and I think it's something that others with this combo should be aware of, is that these are two that can very quickly morph, especially if you're not paying attention, into analysis paralysis.
Oh, the deliberative and
The
analytical
deliberative
together?
and analytical together is, I describe it as my dungeon pair. So when I got trained as a coach, my beautiful facilitator made this great analogy. So we often talk about whether our talents are sort of in their balcony or in their basement. Are you using them really well, and out in the sun and doing the right things and applying them in the right way? Or are they sort of in the dungeon? You're not thinking about them in a thoughtful way. You're not applying them in a mature fashion. That's really the basement. When you get two themes going to the basement at the same time, you've essentially built yourself a dungeon. So these are my dungeon pair.
I see.
And I have to be very thoughtful. That's going to sound weird. I've got to be very conscientious about those two getting together and getting me into a circular thinking pattern of, well, what other risks, what other cause and effect haven't I considered yet? And if you do that enough, you can kill your own energy, you can kill the energy of others. It really prohibits a lot of forward action. So it actually diminishes what we were just talking about in terms of harmony and the practical application of what you're learning. It yeah, it can very much get in the way.
Yeah, I could see that, like you were saying in the pre-show, that this is one of those ones where you're like, you may be less likely to build relationships with people who can't like give you the information. They can't prove it, it's going on that
Yeah,
gut, or that ability to kind of squash the energy of
yeah,
of others if they really haven't thought it through.
yeah. And I would definitely agree with that. It's when you sort of peel back and put the deliberative to the side for a second, we're talking about just a sort of pure analytical, and we know that all of our themes don't operate in silos. But if you were to try and concentrate on just this one, I would very much see that, and I've seen it myself, have a negative impact on work relationships, life relationships. That, if you get somebody really excited coming to me and be like, I think this is really going to work, and my initial question is, well, prove it to me. Why do you
Yeah,
think it's going to work? What data do you have to show me that you're on the right track? That can really kill somebody's energy and enthusiasm pretty quickly. And so then
yeah,
you've not only got them to play smaller, but you also haven't allowed their enthusiasm to sort of infectiously positively impact a team, and maybe thinking, get us thinking in a different way. Um,
sure.
so that can have an impact. I would also say, um, in a similar vein, but almost the opposite side of the coin, is um, not willing to take a chance on somebody. So if somebody comes
Oh,
to me and they consistently show up without thinking it through or without the data, I'm not as likely to engage with them in the future. And that, again, I'm essentially cutting off a relationship or a potential relationship because they're not showing up in my way, and
mm-hmm.
showing me the data or showing something that can work. Um, so I just, it's another factor that if there's that repeated, again, a sort of a repeated pattern, but of a
Right.
different sort, that they're not showing up, being thoughtful, that can start to diminish my interest. And therefore I'm cutting myself, or somebody else that has analytical might be cutting themselves off from potential relationships that could develop if you gave them a chance.
Sure. Yeah. One I had that I noticed in myself and then have also noticed in others is can get a little overwhelmed by information. Like I don't need to know all that. That's great that you have all that data and you know all of that, but I don't need all of that information. Or maybe like this is too much. Like I have a tendency to do this too, where I found I need all the information. I need to gather
Right.
it all to make sure that I've like checked all my T, or dotted all my I's and crossed all my T's, getting all of that. But I tend to get bogged down in that and making sure I have all
Okay.
of it, and then needing to like regurgitate that out to someone else. Like we talked about that in an email. Like there's an email with 4 paragraphs, and this could have been like a couple of bullet points. But I'm like, okay, well, I needed the info to be valid, to make sure it was valid. So I'm giving you
Yeah.
all the info so you can make
Yeah.
sure it's valid. But I might be doing this to someone who is totally not interested in the
Yeah.
details. They're just like, just give me the facts. Like
Right.
this is not necessary. Do you find that similarity too?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I've had to tone down in my own life. I used to, early on in my professional life, write super long emails. And it
Mhm.
was because I was coming to it with an analytical mind of, I need to validate my
Yeah.
request or my idea. And so here's my backup. A
Yep.
lot of other people's, it's funny. You've got your background up with Activator and Achiever and a couple of the others that are a little bit more action focused. And what I have discovered, particularly after becoming a coach, is that there's so many others that are really about, just give me what I need to do. It
Mhm.
might be an achiever responsibility, pairing in somebody, and they're just like, just give me something to
Right.
get off the starting line, or tell me where the goalpost is. I don't care about how you got to XYZ.
Right.
Just tell me what's the next step. So I think that there is a very valid concern there, um, in terms of interacting with others around analytical, and how you balance that or moderate it so that it's,
Right.
you're using it in the best way possible. I actually,
In that Goldilocks zone, right?
right, in that Goldilocks zone. I actually just, given what you just shared, though, it actually makes me want to go back to our first question a little bit in terms of how this has shown up for you, or how you think about
Mm-hmm.
your analytical, given that it's your first strategic thinking, it's
Yeah.
still in your supporting themes, which means you're tapping into it some of the time. What does that look like?
Yeah, I think I made this like kind of comparison when we talked about this in the pre-show. It's like my baking essentials or maybe my cooking essentials. Like I might use the
Okay.
same like 5 ingredients and everything. So that would be, my top five. I'm using
Yeah.
those all day. Salt, pepper, garlic, onion. I don't know, whatever,
Yeah.
pepper, I don't know, something else.
Flour, sugar.
Something, right? Yeah. If we're
Yeah.
talking about baking, yeah, flour, sugar, butter,
Eggs.
always,
Yeah.
right? Always. And
Right.
then there's like okay, well, I'm going to make oatmeal cookies, so now I need oatmeal. So like there's those other staples that are in the cupboard. I always have them. Like
Yeah.
I never, I'm like, when I go to the store, I'm buying it regardless of whether I think I need it or not, because they're always stocked and in the cupboard. That would be like my analytical. It's always stocked and in the cupboard.
Got it.
It's there. So when I need it, I'm pulling that out. And where I find that the most useful for me is when people are telling me stories or giving me information. And we talked
Okay.
about this as like being our BS detector, or perhaps
Okay. Yeah.
a nonsense, like you're coming to me with something that doesn't make any sense. And it's this thing with me, I need information given to me in order. So if you're telling me about the
Oh, okay.
events of something that has
Yeah.
happened, and you are jumping from thing to thing, and I don't know if this happened before that happened or what order these things came in, right away my analytical's like, something's up with this story, like I'm not sure I believe this.
Yeah.
And then I start asking questions, and the more questions I ask, the more I'm filtering it through this like data lens that I have, where I've like keep collecting these little bits of information. So that's where I see it like playing out the most in me. Like that's where I pick it up. I don't think that's coming from any of these. Like I'm thinking about the way that stuff goes. I'm thinking about my responsibility, my achiever, all of my top strengths. Don't filter that information like
Yeah.
I believe analytical does. And
Yeah.
so that's where I see that coming through
Yeah.
for me as
I,
that positive influence.
yeah. So it's interesting because just hearing you talk that through, first of all, I was smiling and kind of laughing on the inside the whole time, because that is very much, I have similar tendencies, maybe not the exact same, but stories told out of order. The BS, does this data add up? And I think what that really comes back to, when we look back at that sort of quick short definition from Gallup, is
Yeah.
searching for reasons and causes. And what you're talking about is you've given me the end of the story, but you haven't told me what caused the end of the story.
Right.
And so then it becomes very disconnected and disorienting. And so then you want to keep digging further. And so then that goes to the statement in that short definition, which is you're looking for the factors. Okay, that was the situation. What was playing into that whole story?
Right.
And so I think you sharing that is fantastic. I also love the baking analogy. I think it's, I was actually having a picture of you with like 12 bins of oats, because if you're picking it up on every shopping trip and yet you only use it occasionally, that was kind of a funny image that came to mind. But I think in general the analogy is quite appropriate, and I think it's beautiful that you thinking about it that way.
And I've kind of played it both ways, like even like your toolbox and having like your tool belt, where you have
Yep.
those tools that you're always using that are on your belt, they're on your person, but you know that you have that one weird screwdriver in the toolbox that you can go and grab.
Yeah.
Like you have it, you know where it is. It just takes a little more effort to go in
Right.
and pull it out. So that's how I think of analytical and how that shows up for me.
Yeah.
That
But I think I love that you've beautifully described what a supporting theme is. I think what really is impactful for people is understanding what that looks like from a further down the list kind of perspective of you're filtering, and it shows up when you need to detect whether something is true or not. I think that almost black and white. I think that was the other piece that
Oh,
I maybe
yes.
should have struck upon with harmony is analytical tends to have there's either a yes or no answer. This
Yeah.
is either going to work or it's not.
It proves it or doesn't.
It proves
Yeah.
it or it doesn't. Yes. So I think that's the other thing is if people are starting to think about becoming aware of their themes, if you're noticing yourself going to a black, white, yes, no, if then kind of thinking, you may have analytical.
Mhm.
So uh, so yeah, so
Yeah,
we talked. So thank you very much for sharing that. I didn't mean to
yeah,
go backwards to go forwards, but I do think it was important for our listeners to understand. Mine shows up in certain ways because it's in my,
yeah.
very close to the top of my list. You have yours as a supporting theme, and so it shows up
Mhm.
maybe a little different. We're also two very different individuals.
Right.
So,
Do you
so
do
sorry,
you
go
want
ahead.
to talk about like the positive ways this shows up? Because
Yeah,
I think we've hit the negatives and then we've like
yeah,
kind of segued into this like place where it also helps.
yeah,
At least
very much so.
in my case in this. So
Yeah.
let's hear about how this works for you.
So I'm gonna tag along, or build upon the idea that you've already laid out about sort of this BS detector. Um, is that I am not often swayed or convinced by emotional or anecdotal evidence. So
Yeah.
a lot of the marketing materials out there, as coaches, I'm sure you get this same sort of stuff. A ton of marketing stuff from other people trying to sell you on master classes of this, that, and the other. And there's very much always an emotional plea of, oh, you've got to do this. It's going to improve the world, all this other stuff. I'm like, okay, just give me the meat. Like, what is actually the impact here of, participating in this course or taking a certain action or investing in a certain
Yeah.
tool? Analytical is really helpful, along with a couple of my other themes, but I think analytical really kind of drives the car on this one of sorting through a lot of that emotional um, tugging that people try to do. And the other thing is anecdotal
Oh,
evidence. So in one of my previous lives, we would be running events, and of course, you get to the debrief meeting about the event, and one of my colleagues would be like, well, I heard from these 3 or 5 people that walked up to us and said, well, we should have done this, and this better. So we're going to change that for next year. And my mind immediately goes, well, wait a minute. There were nearly 1,000 people at this event. We're going to change something because 5 people happen to grab your ear in the middle of the thing. Whereas, some of those events we would actually do formal surveys for and find out, everything was fine. And you just got the 5 squeakiest wheels
right.
mention what their problem was. And then other times the data wasn't there, and yet we're still making changes for 5 people out of 1,000.
Mhm.
That always, for someone with analytical like myself, that doesn't always sit super well. So I think that
Sure.
there's an ability to not be swayed by that, if you're being thoughtful about it. I think
Yeah.
I think the other positive that I sort of started to highlight with my basketball example is recognizing patterns of behavior. So, I call it my anticipation engine, but I also think for leaders and other people um, around some of the analytical, the analytical person like myself can start to notice patterns of what they're doing really well or what's getting in their way at times. And so I think
Yeah.
that there's a great power to it that way. um, I have also found it to be really helpful. I started talking about this in terms of my coaching practice, but starting to notice words or phrases that are repeated. So a lot of
Mhm.
times, you're just listening to listen, and you might not. Somebody without analytical, of course, I can't talk to somebody without analytical because it's in me, it's part of me.
Right.
But for me, I'm constantly catching those words. Others, those words and phrases might fly by and not mean much. What I have found, and I'm still getting better at this application, but um, I have, for a few clients, taken a moment to say, okay, stop right there. You said that word 6 times. What exactly does
What
that
does it
word mean? Or
mean?
what does that phrase mean to you? And all of a sudden we're on a different, we've opened up another coaching aha moment because I've taken the time to recognize the pattern of what they're saying and then use that as an opportunity to open up.
I
So
think that's wonderful, a
yeah,
wonderful use of it, and it's great to see, like, even you're a seasoned coach. You've been doing this a while. Like, it's not like it's your first time, and you've had clients, and just even still, like, investing in yourself, investing in your own strengths,
yeah,
and seeing where those are coming out and how they can help you, in your normal, like, everyday life, just everything you do, just seeing it play out, and
yeah,
then also really trying to intentionally focus on that in
yeah,
order to help your clients, I think is really amazing. Amazing
yeah.
use of it.
I try. I'm not sure I always get it right, but it is a place where the theme
Wonderful.
sort of on its own has been helpful in my life and in my work. So
Sure.
I wanted to mention that to others that might be thinking about, well, I don't love data spreadsheets, but I have analytical. Where
Right.
is this coming out? It might be
Sure.
in, come out in other ways. So I think that
Yeah,
that's
I could see that one specifically, like, the way you're using it now. If you also have, like, high relationship building themes, where that's probably something that someone with
yeah,
analytical and a lot of other high relationship building themes, it's probably something they see. Being able to see those patterns in people and what they do, what they say, and being able to use that to help them get to where they want to go. I
yeah,
could see that,
yeah,
definitely. How really cool.
yeah.
Have you seen, that's kind of, we're kind of moving into this. So have you seen this theme show up differently in others that you've coached? Have you
So
noticed any big ahas?
yeah, so I'm actually hoping this might be a place where you're going to help us out a little bit more because in the number of people I've coached, I've actually had only a few that have had analytical, in their top 5 or 10.
Hmm.
Um, I think the most intriguing one to me was somebody that had both analytical and discipline in their top five. And the way it came out, again, this is actually almost a beautiful combo of sort of data spreadsheets and words.
Yeah.
She had come to our coaching conversation with this massive, she'd actually printed it out. It went across 3 or 4 pieces of paper. She taped them all together. But if I recall, she had like each of the five of her top 5 talent themes going down one side, and then going across in one column was, I think, her own thoughts or observations about that theme. So, you and I often do a highlighting exercise with people. She'd
Hmm.
actually gone the extra step, taking that information out, putting it into one block.
Nice.
Then the next column was something like questions she wanted to ask me about that theme. So those were all neatly organized and,
Wow.
categorized. And then I think she'd left space for my observation about the theme. So she wanted to be able to capture those. And then there were 3 or 4 other columns that had to do with, maybe I forget, maybe one of them was, stories or anecdotes she had about applying that theme so she could talk about it or,
Wonderful.
tell me how it was showing up. But this whole idea of having it organized in that way, I thought was a really interesting way so that she can go back and see the connections between what her thoughts were, what my thoughts were, how I answered her question, what the resulting answer was, be able to again make that path from response to understanding
Yeah.
is, I think, something that comes out in analytical, and she just had sort of the discipline to come up with a structure for it.
Hmm.
So but I think it was just a very interesting way of seeing analytical play out. Of she had set up a system for herself to be able to see those connections.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It was it
And
was
I,
beautiful, especially from a coach's perspective.
oh,
I
yeah.
was like, well, okay, now we got strengths on full tilt now. So
Right. Well, and what like a wonderful piece of information for her to be able to go back to and reflect on and add to as she
yeah,
goes throughout her career, and really digging into who she is and how she works. Like, what a great piece of information she
yeah,
has to pull all of that data
yeah,
together. That's really
yeah,
amazing.
yeah,
Yeah, in a similar vein, like, so many of the people that I've coached that have analytical high, they're like, I think of them as deep thinkers.
yeah,
And maybe it's not it takes a long time to analyze the data, because I think we had some conversation about that in the pre-show. um I thought from my point, my viewpoint on analytical, because it does take me longer to analyze that
Yeah.
data, I thought it was this deep thinking means a lot of time to analyze the data that's in front of you. But you shared with me that that's not always true, right?
So I think it could play out. This is my harmony, right? Balancing both sides. I think
Right.
it could take both. There are times where it shows up in one of two ways. I think one is what you're talking about, which is oftentimes those with analytical, and I'm speaking a little bit more from personal experience, but also from what I've read and from what I've heard from other coaches around analytical,
Mhm.
is that those with analytical can look at a large, say, data set. Let's go back to the Excel spreadsheet for a second.
Sure.
Look at all that and fairly quickly understand the relationship between
Mm,
two or three factors. Okay. They kind of know how to process. They might immediately gravitate to, oh, I know which columns I want to grab to put in the pivot table to make the most sense.
sure.
That sort of instantaneous understanding maybe debunks the initial thought you had of, oh, this is going to take them a long time, or
Mhm.
this is super deep. So there is that sort of quickness to action that comes from, again, practice and being aware of your talent themes.
Sure.
That can be speedy.
Sure.
I would also agree with, here's where harmony kicks in and says, also agree with something else. I would also say that those with analytical, there is a depth. This
Mhm.
is, we talked a little bit about in the pre-show of some themes go super broad. I
Yeah.
personally, I think of like woo. Woo
Mhm.
is very
Lots
broad.
of people.
Lots
Yeah.
of people, right? Breadth of social circle versus maybe
Yes.
depth. And I'm not taking anything away from the depth that people with woo might build with their people, but they are looking
Absolutely.
for breadth of audience, breadth of
Yeah.
relationships. Okay. Conversely, analytical tends to have a depth component. It is
Mhm.
one, it's, I think, a little bit along the lines of deliberative, about thinking deeply about risks,
Yeah.
focus, being sort of a singular focus and a singular mind. Um, this analytical theme, I think, shares that same sort of depth. And
Okay.
that part, I would agree with your initial statement of,
Yeah.
this is deep
The deep
thinking. This is
thinkers.
this is
Mhm.
this is going to take time. It's not so much the time component, it's what level of thought do you get behind it.
Sure.
Um, so yeah, so I guess that would be my response to your observation around that.
Yeah. The
Because
yeah, the other one I had, and I'm not sure if it comes with the pairings of the people that I've coached or that I've
okay,
been around that have analytical high, because there is that deliberative component that I do see and have seen paired in you and in some others that are very close to me. I have another pairing of learner with analytical, and I could see where even, and I think you have learner high
yeah,
too,
well, I've
so
got to learn
that
number one. So
there we go again.
yeah,
So I could see those two coming together, and that feels really heavy and really deep to me, because you are pulling all of this information, gathering, learning all you can in order to be
yeah,
able to maybe quickly process the information
yeah.
that's in front of you. Um, it it makes me think, based on the people I've coached and how I've seen it play out, that there is a level of accuracy um, in those that have high analytical, that things that come from them are typically very accurate.
I'd like to agree with that, just for the sake of maybe defending myself from past decisions. Um, I think there is a component to that. Um, I would agree to the point of, if you are asking somebody from an analytical standpoint around, um, are we making the best decision? They're going to give you the best assessment they can with the information they have.
Okay.
And so I do think, your statement about learner and even a little bit of mix, seasoning in a little bit of deliberative too,
Hmm.
um, that there is a thoughtfulness and a cycle of asking, listening, understanding, ask again.
Yeah.
And that's kind of your drill going down. That's that depth component. It's,
Mhm.
can we keep getting better and better action? One of the
Oh,
things I,
it's like those little diagrams. Is that where you were going with it? Like if you open this door, then this happens, and then this, and then there's like the yes or no. I don't remember what those things are
that's
called.
okay.
Can you help me?
You're talking about like a logic tree?
Yes, that's where I
Yeah.
was going. Yeah.
Yeah. So there is a love of sort of logic trees, the if then component to Analytical. Maybe I should have struck upon that when we were first talking about how that shows up, how this theme shows up for me is, and it goes to the black and white statement we were
Yes.
making before of, if this happens, then this is the result. If this happens, then this is the result. And following those
Hmm.
on a regular basis
That
is,
brings that depth.
that's that depth, and that's that
Yeah.
analytical really coming to life. Um, I think one of the pieces that I probably should have brought up with, I was talking about deliberative analytical and being that analysis paralysis. One of the
Hmm.
components I have found that might actually be helpful for some of our listeners is a way to break out of that, or to figure out what is an appropriate level of accuracy, is a sense of time. Now, that might come from my
Oh,
responsibility place, but
sure.
having some sort of understanding of what is enough.
Hmm.
When do you have, yes, you can increase your sample size from 1,000 to 5,000, but is that actually going to get you that much more insight on what's actually happening? I'm not a big statistician person, but
Right.
I remember hearing that, like, even to sample a state as large as, like New York, all you need is like 1,500 people, and if you get the right sample,
Mm,
it's representative of the entire state. And they've got,
sure.
I don't know, what is it, like 6 million people.
Right.
um that's really amazing. But so that goes back to your accuracy, is what's enough,
Yeah. Right.
and understand what that is. For me, it has to do with a sense of time. You have this amount of time to collect as much data as you can. Give me your best decision in that time frame, and then move forward.
Yeah.
um so I think that that's something else that might be helpful in understanding this
Well,
theme.
and it kind of goes, my point about the accuracy is kind of two-sided too, because it's about those that I know that have analytical high, they bring forth information that's based on accurate data or what they believe is accurate data. I also
Yeah.
feel like when they are looking for information from others, they don't want that anecdotal information. They
Right.
want the accurate data.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of where I was going with the
Okay.
accuracy. It's really too, it's really, no, it's okay. It's because it's really two-sided. I
Yeah.
hadn't really thought too far into that, that it really is coming both ways.
Yeah.
They want to be accurate and provide as accurate information as they
Right.
can, as is possible in the
Yeah.
moment, but that they also want to receive that accurate data as
Yeah.
well.
I would
Right.
definitely agree with, from that perspective. Then we go back to sort of the anecdotal stuff. That's not
Yeah.
an accurate depiction of
Right.
the vast majority of people that might say have attended your event or bought your
Right.
product, or otherwise. um
Sure.
so yeah.
Well, so we've talked a little bit about pivot tables and some other ideas, maybe some images that come to mind around this
Yeah.
theme. Do you want to share with us what you have for images about this theme?
Yeah. So I'm going to basically bypass the pivot table and pivot graph, because we've already kind of covered that one. So for those of you that know that tool, great, go for it. That's a wonderful image to keep in mind.
Right.
I think if I was to pull one from pop culture,
Mhm.
The one that first came to mind, and you've actually helped me think about a couple others, and I'm going to let you talk about those. But the one I would pick is the image of Rain Man, played by Dustin Hoffman.
Hmm.
And it's when Tom Cruise's character, I always forget the brothers, they're two brothers, and I forget their names, but that's beside the point in this example. It's when they go to Vegas,
Yes.
and Tom Cruise's character realizes that his brother, Dustin Hoffman, can count cards,
Hmm.
and noticing the patterns and the probabilities of which cards are going to show up, and they rake in a fortune before leaving the casino. But it's that whole just internal mindset of calculating and figuring out what's going to happen next.
Hmm.
It might be a helpful image. I don't know if it's the most helpful, but it's the one that came to mind first.
I was, when you first had brought this up, I was thinking about when he like when they drop the thing of the toothpicks and he knows how many toothpicks were
Oh,
in it.
yeah,
And I'm like, oh my gosh, this like ability to like run these numbers so quickly just overwhelms me.
yeah. I don't want this one disclaimer or caveat I will put on this is I'm not trying to tie this theme with anything on the autism spectrum or any other,
Right. No.
mental difference that might be out there. It was just that capability, the seeing
It's
what's
very
happened
raw.
and understand
Like,
what it
yeah.
is. So yeah. So
Yeah.
I do remember that scene as well, where he drops something,
Like
tells
the
you exactly how
toothpicks.
many toothpicks and pennies
Right.
and whatever else is on the ground. So
The one from and I don't know how like well known it is, but my husband used to watch that show, the person of interest,
okay,
with the character, it was Ben from Lost,
yeah.
um
And then
that
Jim
guy,
Caviezel was
and Jim Caviezel, yes.
yeah.
And Ben, who is Finch in that movie, is like highly analytical, and he made an algorithm that was able to like go through the like find the patterns in people to predict the possibility of a violent crime happening. And I always thought that was really interesting, like that like he was so very highly analytical, he could like figure out a way to predict those things from happening. And then
Yeah.
his buddy Jim's character
Jim's
could
character, yes.
could go out and be the crime stopper in that moment. But
Yeah.
that one was one of the ones that came to mind for me.
Yeah. The other one, when you
Thinking
brought
about
that one
movie.
up, was the other one, it was on CBS. I think it was called Numbers.
Hmm.
And it had
Mhm.
basically two brothers. One worked for the FBI. The other one was, I think, a mathematician from Caltech or something. And they were always helping the FBI at the LA office. And the mathematical brother, there's usually almost always a scene where about halfway through, the mathematician would talk about some mathematical principle
Hmm.
or theorem that could be applied to the crime fighting or crime solving that they needed to do. And so, they have all these like numbers kind of float off the screen or off a
Mm-hmm.
whiteboard and get three-dimensional. And the math is always pretty accurate or spot on. But again, that sort of image of the processing and what's going on, and how can you
Yeah.
find the pattern, sort of approach, always sort of struck me. So when you mentioned person of interest, that was then the one I jumped to.
Yep.
I think that's a great one as well. It's for those that know it.
So those random TV shows that we
Yeah.
watch.
I think both of them were only on for like 3 or 5
Yeah,
seasons,
not very long. I know,
but
and they were both excellent shows.
yeah.
So thinking about the ways that we've seen these work in others, and then in the way you've used them, can you provide for us and our listeners, maybe some blind spots or some places that this theme might negatively impact the team, either from the team members standpoint or the team leader standpoint? Can you share with us
Yeah.
what some of those might be, and then maybe even some ideas to combat that?
Yeah. We'll have to think about combating it
or
first,
or toning
combating it
or
second, but
toning it down.
toning it down. I think, in this, I know in previous episodes we've looked at, the difference between sort of the individual contributor and the team leader. I think this is one where the bullet points that I came up with really kind of cross both roles.
Yeah.
And we've already kind of touched on this because I have a tendency to do this on occasion, but it's that diminishing the emotional excitement. So if, particularly in a team leader role, if you have somebody from your team come to you with this grand idea and they've got a lot of excitement, maybe they've even got a couple of the first followers on board, but you quickly start in with, well, prove to me that this is going to work, show me the data, how many people are asking for this, whether it's a service or a good or something. That prove it mentality quickly chops the legs out from any sort of ongoing energy. And if you consistently do that, then people are going to stop bringing their best ideas to you because
Mhm.
they're going to feel like they've got to do all their homework. And some of the homework may not be able to be done until you actually launch it.
Right.
So there's a balance there that needs to be considered. But I
Mhm.
think if you constantly go with an analytical sort of approach, you chop out that negative, that emotional excitement.
Yeah.
I think tied to that, or in a similar fashion, the emotional aspect is, we've talked a lot about measurements or numbers, and somebody with analytical is really can often look at the world through that lens of, there's got to be data. You've got to be able to measure this. You got to bring me something that we can put a scale on. Okay. There are parts of our lives that are unmeasurable. The level of grief somebody is feeling, or emotions, life circumstances. There's not so much like, oh, you're dealing with 12 factors and your fellow colleagues only dealing with 3, so you have it worse than them. That's not how life works. And so I think if there's the consistent attempt to quantify everything in people's lives, whether it's a colleague or whether it's a team leader looking at their team, if you're constantly trying to measure everything, you diminish who we are as working human beings, or just as human beings. So I think that can be a negative impact of this theme, when you don't consider what's unmeasurable.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I could see that, like you were saying in the first one, even that maybe in contrast to it, you might get hung up on all of the details to a point where, like, if we don't have all of the questions answered about where this is going to go, we can't move forward. So I could see where in both cases, it's about that measurable response that might not have a measuring tool for it. There's no way to actually measure that. So I think that was a wonderful way of bringing that out.
I think, in sort of contrast to what we were talking about in the very first short description, all factors that might affect a situation, some of those factors are not going to be measurable. And yes, it's a factor. Yes, your spouse or maybe one of your team members' spouses is dealing with a serious illness, cancer, or any of the others that are out there. That you can't really measure the impact that that's having on an individual. You just know it's a factor.
Right.
The raw or negative side of that is focusing on, trying to measure the impact that that's having on an individual.
Or assuming it's going to be consistent, because we have good days, we're people, we have good days and bad days.
Good days, bad days. And everything in between, it's that scale. So so without sort of beating that bullet to a pulp, I think I want to probably move on more to the positive side, because analytical can definitely go dark quickly because of its depth. If you start going down, you can get sort of
we can keep
trapped in that hole. Keep digging. What's the old phrase? If you find yourself in a hole, stop digging.
Yes, exactly. So we're gonna stop digging and start adding some dirt back to this hole. So when you think about the best ways in which this theme can contribute to a team, whether a team leader or team members, what do you have to share with us?
So this is almost going to sound like the opposite of what I was talking about in terms of that emotional excitement. I think one of the best ways that those with analytical can come out, essentially in support of emotional enthusiasm, is, okay, let me work with you to build some factual excitement. That when we go as a collaborative to our boss to say, hey, this person is really excited about this idea. I've already run some numbers. We think that there's some legs to this. Let's move forward. I think that pairing can be really, really impactful.
Absolutely.
I think about somebody like with positivity, is very emotionally driven. Any of the influencing things that is all about trying to get people on board. Analytical can kind of come to that through a different domain and a different perspective and just add. It's a value add. So I think from an individual standpoint, this is where I am going to sort of differentiate between sort of an individual contributor and team leader.
Sure.
So that's sort of from the individual contributor standpoint. When I think about team leaders that have analytical high, I think it's seeing and addressing patterns in team behavior. So you might start to be aware of those words and phrases, or how somebody is always coming to the meeting and maybe being in either in cahoots or in conflict with somebody else on the team.
Mm-hmm.
Noticing that early, taking the moment to address it because you consistently see the behavior, is a good way to get your team to better collaborate sooner rather than later. So I think that's one. Second contribution would be to better evaluate the cause and effects of organizational plans and goals and what impact those are going to have on the team. So starting to see that bigger picture, see what's coming, and then sort of start to be able to assess its impact, and then what that measurable impact is going to be, and then figuring out what the team behavior is going to need to look like to potentially address that. So seeing, again, that cause and effect. The cause is the organization has just made some sort of change in its strategy or in its focus. Mm-hmm. How does that then impact my team, and be able to do that in a rational way, versus the emotional, oftentimes emotionally charged ways that teams start to, scatter or get worried that this focus is now going to make our team obsolete, or we're going to have layoffs or something. So starting to see that pattern before it actually gets to the team is someplace where the team leader can really contribute. And then I also think the last one would be really to provide, this goes back to your comment about depth, well thought out metrics. There are a lot of metrics that get thrown around, and it's just sort of perceived as, well, this is best practice. Well, if maybe that measure is outside of the control of your team, that's not really a good metric. Sure. So figuring out that depth of thought before you start to lay out, okay, these are the metrics we're going to hold ourselves accountable to, I think is another place where Analytical can really think through that cause and effect of what can we actually have a cause on, and then what is the impact of that on the organization.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
I think the only things I would add to that would be in relationship to working with someone who has high analytical. So I know you need facts and data. I know you're like, if you and I are working together and I bring you a harebrained idea, I know I'm going to need to probably think through a few things. Like, you're going to ask me some questions, so I need to have some information to back that up. But if I'm really excited, I want you on board with me. So knowing that you can pull your analytical teammate in to help you find some of that data, because you might not be able to, you might not have what it takes to find even the information to get to some of the answers that your analytical teammate might be asking. But there are ways to get that. And if you bring that analytical teammate in with you, who is going to help like think through some of these questions and maybe work out, okay, well, we can't do it that way, but if we, just, do this, this little change, we can get, a few steps forward. So I think really thinking about it in that like teaming perspective of pulling together our talents and being able to like understand you're not coming from this place of wanting to just squash it. You're thinking realistically.
If you don't mind me jumping in for just a second, Jen, what you said just triggered another idea in mind, which is that oftentimes, and I can't speak for everybody with Analytical, but I'd like to think that this is sort of a trend that others might see in their analytical partners, whether at work or in life, is that if you bring an idea and say, I think I know how to measure this, or I think I know what data.
Oh, good.
Somebody with Analytical will be like, oh, actually, I know exactly what you're after. I know exactly what fields to pull out of our data system and make that, again, not just get the data, but then also be able to help break it down in a way that makes sense. Yep. And they might also provide the aspect of, well, that's how you're thinking about breaking down the data. I know that our data system or the data points we currently collect aren't quite going to fit that, but we've got these other alternatives, because those with Analytical are probably keeping track of what data points they can get a hold of if they so choose. That might be a little informed on my, in me through my learner, that I'm always sort of curious about what else is out there. But I think Analytical, those with analytical talents tend to have an awareness of what data points are out there. What are people measuring? What can be gathered in quick fashion, or what's going to take
Sure.
time. So I thought what you
That's,
were saying was beautiful, but it got me thinking about
yep.
somebody that comes, because I've had that happen in my own life where somebody will come to me and say, hey, got an idea for this new initiative. We'd like to pull this field, this field, and this field out of our data system to see, how many people would be impacted by this new initiative or benefit
Mhm.
from this new initiative. And I go, well, we can't quite do that, but I can do this. Does this get you
Yeah.
to the same place? And be able to evaluate that on the front end is, I think, another sort of super contribution that those with analytical talents can offer.
Well, and even just in that example that you just provided, you and I have done that for our work together, where
Yeah.
I had an idea of, well, what if we pull it from this? And you're like, oh, hold on. And next thing I know, boom, here's a spreadsheet, all the data's there, and he's already filtered it out to show me like the answers that we want. So it, it's amazing how when you pair people together and really
Yeah.
are using and leaning on their strengths, how amazing you can, like how quickly we got to information that we needed
Yeah.
just from sharing of information and,
Yeah.
pulling that together. So I think that one was one that it just caught me as being not high analytical, but I do want the facts. That's important to me, at least to get the information and that it's right. The other one kind of goes back to that best contribution to a team is that, and we talked about this in the pre-show too. Um, Kind of that email that's the gigantic email. It might
Yeah.
be more of like a visual of a big book, and it's got
Oh,
like the answer on the cover, and then here's all the backup data, and it's a book
right.
like this thick or something, and all of the data is there, but you don't always have to show your work. And
Right.
that might be one of those ways where analytical might want to see the work, like how did you get there and what is
Yeah.
that data that got you to that answer, whereas others in your team might not need to see it all. But if
Yeah.
they know their analytical teammate has all of that backup, it can,
Yeah.
give you almost that feeling of like a parachute or something, that like
Yeah.
safety net that's going to hold you in case somebody starts questioning it. Well, hold
Right.
on, we got all the information that you might
Yeah.
need.
Yeah, I think when you and I talked about that sort of idea in our pre-show, we talked about another image that people might want to keep in mind is um, like a PhD dissertation.
Oh,
My
yes.
brother has gone through that. I
Yes.
have not.
Yeah, yeah,
He
great.
gets to hold the PhD title. I get to be envious. But I remember him basically showing like there's a paragraph or two that's an abstract of the paper. Okay, and that's usually
Mhm.
what gets put out on all the library directories. Oh, we have this resource. Here's the abstract. Okay,
Yes.
very quickly summarizes. This is basically what the research is about. This is generally how they went about it, and this is
Hmm.
generally what the findings were. Now there's 350 pages of the actual research that shows you their methods, what the data um,
Yeah.
graphs were, and the rationale behind all of it, and then a summary of what the data actually told them.
Hmm.
I think that's where that beautiful like
Yeah.
safety net. Here's the
Right.
abstract. This is what you really need in the email. You need the
Yep.
3-line abstract. But if you ask those of us with analytical, we're happy to pull out the 350 pages of research that we've already
Yeah.
done. And it may not be 350 pages, but that
Right.
we're going to bring whatever background work we've
Yeah.
done ahead of time to justify that sort of abstract statement, um, that statement that serves as the abstract for our decision or our suggested course of action.
And I think
Oh,
that's just a
yeah,
beautiful way to build trust with others in your team
yeah,
is knowing that you have somebody on your team like that. I mean, it's such a great thing to know, like we're not just, and even in a team leader, specifically in a team leader, knowing that we're not just willy-nilly going here or there, that there's been thought process behind it, that there's like the data that supports that this is what we should be doing moving
yeah,
forward, and that it's not just this is how we've always done it, that there is some data behind that information.
yeah,
So I love that like that feeling of trust is really important to me. It's
yeah,
one of my beliefs, one of my core values. So that just rings really true to me, is understanding, knowing that like that is one of those ways that analytical can build trust with others. I
Yeah.
think is wonderful.
So Jen, I know I've done a ton of sharing about sort of my analytical. We've had a great conversation for the last hour or so. I'm kind of curious, as somebody that kind of came into this a little bit with more of a learning edge. I mean, you said it's supporting for you. You have an awareness of it. But as you think about our conversation today, I'm curious if there's one or two bullet points that maybe we highlight here at the end. I know, hopefully, if people have listened all the way to this point, they've already gotten some bullet points for themselves. But are there bullet points that you really want people to walk away from this conversation with?
Really, I think it comes back to that not sway. I heard it right from the beginning and all the way to the end, not swayed by emotional evidence. Like it needs to be tangible, real things that we're looking at. That's what you use for that analysis, that you're not someone that I'm going to emotionally sway to do one thing or another based on, it needs to be based on facts. I think that there's a level of comfort to that comes through for me, that it feels like stable. It feels like I can trust it, and we can move forward. And I think that's something that in my analytical team members and teammates and family members who have analytical high, it's one of those things that I know I can count on you. And nice. I think that's a really powerful thing.
Yeah. Good.
You?
I would just
final thoughts.
Yeah, so I would echo everything you just said. I think one of the only other points that I'd probably really highlight is that, and it kind of goes to your statement about being able to trust it, but that when somebody with analytical talents opens their mouth, they've already done the thinking. This is not somebody that's going to likely show up and start spitballing a ton of ideas that they haven't done some due diligence on. And so wonderful. While I am an advocate of everybody having a voice at the table, if you're a team leader listening to people and somebody has analytical talents, you might want to scooch just maybe listen a little closer, or think about their perspective maybe just a smidge bit deeper, because they've done that deep thought. I know we talked a little bit about this in the deliberative. There's a depth of thought before we open our mouths, and that's not to discount anybody else. It's just there's that weight. There's a gravitas to what they're saying because they've done the background.
Well, and I think we even had touched on that a little bit in our last episode about activator. There's not a lot of spitballing that happens that comes out of anyone with deliberative or analytical. I'm going to put the two in the same bucket in this case, because I can see my deliberative working that way too. Yeah. That there is not a lot of this, like, just throwing ideas out there to see what sticks. Yeah. When you do that, I hear it and I see it, and I want to reflect this back to you. When you've had an idea, I know this isn't the first time you had the idea. It's been ruminating back there. You've been thinking about it. You've been going through some of those things. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful point to bring up.
Yeah. So yeah, that would be my sort of closing thought, is just the depth of thought that analytical brings is something to be taken, to be used in a very thoughtful way.
Yeah.
By the team or by a team leader, collectively, as that information is brought forth.
Great.
So with that, this is actually our last episode before the Christmas break. So we're going to be off for a week or two.
Yeah.
And we've got some really exciting shows coming up in the new year. I know both you and I are working on getting some other coaches on to talk about some themes that we don't have, or have very low. I guess we all have all 34 talent themes, but that we don't have particularly high for ourselves.
Right.
So we're going to bring on some awesome other coaches to help us explore those. So if you've listened this far, we again encourage you to subscribe and do all the other things, leave comments, leave reviews. But also we hope that you come back and join us in 2023 as we keep exploring some more of the CliftonStrengths themes, And also, I think we're going to already start talking about some other topics that have come to light in culture, in the business world, and have really come to the attention of Jen and I. We're going to be doing some planning around that here soon. So hopefully we'll have some additional topics for all of our listeners to explore. But with that, I'm going to wish everybody, for whatever holiday you celebrate, a very happy holidays, whether it's Merry Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, and any others. And a very happy new year. And I don't know if Jen, if you want to add your own sentiments on that before we wrap it up.
Just be safe and enjoy your time.
Wonderful. So we wish everybody well, and we'll see you back here again in 2023.
See you
Have a great
soon.
day.